Well, good morning. Good to see everybody here today. I hope you were able to have a really great Thanksgiving, and I hope that you took some time this past week to spend just reflecting on what you have in your life to be grateful for. You know, when I got to Thanksgiving this past week, I took just a few moments to try to make sure I zeroed my mind in on how good God has been to me. And you know, one of the things that I was grateful for was that the incident that happened on our campus ended the way that it did. I was incredibly grateful for, if you're here and you are a law enforcement officer, I want you to know how grateful I am for you and what you do. I'm also very grateful for our security team that every week shows up, and you may not even know that they're here, but they're doing everything they can to make sure that you're safe as well when you come, and so I'm really grateful for that stuff. But here we are at the beginning of yet another Christmas season. And before we get too far into the season, let me ask you a question. What do you want? When it comes to this Christmas season, what is it that you hope happens? I think for most of us, if we were to drill down to the bottom of that question, I think most of us, we want to spend time with our family, we want to spend time enjoying our friends, we want to spend time enjoying each other. I think most of us, when it comes to the Christmas season, what we want are these moments where we experience happiness, where we experience joy, where we experience peace, where we experience tranquility. I think most of us during this Christmas season, what we want is we want to be reminded that this time of year is just different, fundamentally different than other times of the year. The problem is that far too often there's a large gap between what we expect and what we hope for, and then what we actually end up experiencing during the Christmas season. You see, Christmas has a way of just being absolutely chaotic. You see, most of us, what we long for when it comes to Christmas is we long for something that's akin to a Norman Rockwell painting, something just beautiful. But what we end up experiencing is something that's a lot more like, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. And so what we're doing today is we're kicking off this brand new series called Uncluttered. And the whole point of this series is how do we close the gap? How do we close the gap between what we expect and what we hope for and what we actually end up experiencing? And today, over the next 3 weeks, really, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about these three different areas of our lives where, if we take these principles and these truths from God's Word and we apply it to our lives, we'll be able to close the gap. And today I want to talk about our schedules. I want to talk about our schedules during Christmas time, because if we are not careful, by the time that it's all said and done, perhaps every single one of us will be uttering words like this: I'm exhausted, I'm overwhelmed, and I'm overscheduled. And I'm guessing that's not what you had in mind for this Christmas season. I think that Lance Witt, in his book Replenish, captured this whole concept of time in our schedules really well when he said, you can't live life at warp speed without warping your soul. You and I, we were not designed by our Creator to live our life strapped to a rocket. We were not designed by our Creator to live a maxed out schedule where we end up overwhelmed, exhausted, and overscheduled. When you and I live life at warp speed, it has consequences. And that's why I think the Bible talks about time fairly regularly. In Psalm chapter 90, the psalmist cries out to God, and here's what he says. He says, teach us to number our days. God, would you teach us to understand the way that time works? God, would you teach us to be careful about our time? God, would you help us to see time from your perspective? Would you help us to understand the brevity of it and the importance of how we use it? Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. God, if we would see time the way that you see time, we would be wise. Fast forward to the New Testament, and the Apostle Paul sits down and he writes a letter to a church that he started in the city called Ephesus, and he says something very similar. He tells them, be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise. In other words, be careful about your time. Make sure you're wise about this stuff, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. The Bible has some rather strong things to say about our time, but perhaps the most helpful piece of wisdom comes from a story that's probably very familiar to most of us. It occurs in Luke chapter 10, and when we pull up on the scene in Luke chapter 10, Jesus is at the height of his ministry. He's preaching, he's teaching, he's healing, he's doing miracles, and the more of that stuff that he does, the more and more and more people demand from him. His schedule is getting more and more full every single day. The opposition from his enemies, the Pharisees, is becoming more and more intense, and almost every slot on his calendar is full. In Luke chapter 10, Jesus and his disciples are actually on the front end of a holiday season, very much like you and I are right now. For them, the big holiday of the year on the Jewish calendar is Passover. And this is the beginning of the Passover holiday season, and Jesus and his disciples are making their way to Jerusalem to celebrate the holiday. It'll end up being the last time that they do this together, and so Jesus and his disciples, as they're on their way to Jerusalem during the holiday season, they decide to take a pit stop in a city called Bethany. Bethany is a suburb of Jerusalem that actually still exists today, but Jesus decides to go to Bethany because he has some friends that live there. And on a fairly regular basis, Jesus would call time out, and he'd go and he would visit his friends. So he decides to call a time out, and he goes and visits his friends. The story goes this way. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. So Martha lives in Bethany. He's Jesus' close friend. And I imagine for Martha, this day was pretty much like almost every other day. She was out in the city doing her business, going about the stuff that she needed to do for the day. Perhaps she also was aware of the holiday season and was getting ready and getting things in place before the holidays ramped up. But Martha's out there in the city doing her thing when she looks up and she sees Jesus and his disciples. And as soon as she sees Jesus and the disciples, I imagine for Martha, she knew exactly what Jesus wanted. So she made her way to Jesus, and there was the hellos and the warm embraces, and then Martha invites Jesus over to her home. Jesus accepts the invitation, and then Martha hurries back to home so she can get ready for Jesus' arrival. Now I want to pause at this point in the story and ask you a question. What do you normally do in your home when you have a friend who's not super close, but they're kind of in that medium range that decides they're going to come visit you? I don't know what you do, but in my home, there are certain things that we do. We get all the dishes out of the sink and we put them into the dishwasher. We hide the laundry. We turn on those candles. We get that nice scented. We have a few really nice candles that they're magical almost, you know. And so we light those, and the room starts smelling good. And there are some rooms in our house almost always that are impossible to get clean. It would take us months to get it clean. So we close those doors, so kind of out of sight, out of mind. And that's what we do when somebody comes over to our home who's kind of in that medium friend range. But this isn't just any guest for Martha. This is Jesus. Everybody everywhere is talking about Jesus and how they think he's the Messiah. They think that Jesus is going to be the one that at any point in time is going to finally come out and say, look, I'm the Messiah, and then he's going to lead them to overthrow Roman rule and Roman occupation, and then after that, they believe that Jesus is going to be the one that will establish Israel on the international scene once again in a place of power, prominence, and prosperity. Everybody everywhere thinks this is who Jesus is. Now, Martha is also aware that several times along the way, Jesus has not just claimed to be the Messiah, he has claimed to be the Son of God. So this isn't just any guest. Martha hurries back home and she does everything she can to make sure that everything about Jesus' visit is going to be absolutely perfect. Martha doesn't want to offer Jesus soup and sandwiches. She wants to offer Jesus a 7-course meal. She doesn't want her house to be moderately clean. She wants a house that's so clean you could eat off the floor. So she goes home and she gets to work getting ready for Jesus' arrival. Then later on in the day, I imagine Jesus and his disciples show up and they get to her home. And in the next verse we read, she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. So Jesus and the disciples show up, and Mary's there and she greets them, and I'm sure there were things that Mary had to do. I'm sure Mary had cooking and she had cleaning and she had groceries and she had all kinds of stuff that she needed to be doing. But Mary rightfully understands, man, I've got an opportunity here that I don't get an awful lot. And so instead of doing that other stuff, she invites Jesus and the disciples to sit down, and she sits down in the middle of them and she just spends time with Jesus. Now, of course, the Bible doesn't say this. This is my imagination, but I kind of imagine that she sat down with Jesus and she said, hey, look, Jesus, how are you doing really? When you're not giving that answer that you kind of give without thinking about it, when you get really honest, how are you doing really? And how's ministry? Look, I've heard the Pharisees are being real jerks lately. Tell me about that. How are you doing? I heard about something you did in a city over, and man, it was a really cool story, and it got back around to me, and is this really what happened? And she just sat down and enjoyed her time with Jesus. And while all this is happening, Martha is just running as fast as she could, just trying her best to get everything done. Luke describes her activity this way: but Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. Translation: Martha was busy being busy. She was just busy being busy. And I want to kind of take a little bit of a time out from our story here to make an important observation, because most of us know how this story goes. I think it's worth noting that Martha wasn't busy doing bad things. She wasn't busy getting involved in sinful things. She wasn't busy with evil intent. She was busy doing good things, and she was actually busy doing things that you might even argue were important and maybe even necessary. She's not a bad person. And you can almost hear the narrative in her head. She's probably thinking something, well, this has to be done, and it's not just anybody, it's Jesus, and if I don't do it, nobody's going to do it. If I don't do it, it's not going to get done right. She's just busy. She's not bad. She's well-intended. She's doing good things. She's just busy being busy. Someone once said that if the devil can't make you really bad, he'll just make you really busy. And Martha is just really busy. She's distracted. But Martha is in the middle of this frenzy of activity. And she's doing everything that she can. But the activity, she can't keep up with it, and she can't get it all done. And again, I'm imagining here a little bit, but I imagine at some point when she starts to realize that she's sinking in the middle of all this activity, that she looks around for her sister Mary. She probably naturally assumes that Mary's somewhere else in the home trying to help her out, but when she looks across the room, she sees that Mary instead is sitting down there just talking to Jesus, smiling and enjoying herself. And I would like to believe that at first, Martha just tried to do subtle hints, where she kind of tried to make eye contact with Mary and kind of did, this sort of thing. Or maybe she was in the kitchen and she banged around a little bit louder than normal. But despite her best efforts, Mary had made a decision and she was sticking to her guns. And finally, Martha reaches a breaking point. She finds herself in a moment where she is exhausted, where she's overwhelmed, where she's overscheduled, and what she does next is not even close to pretty. What she does next, I think, was uncomfortable for every single person in the room. If you've ever been in a scenario like this, where something like this happened, you know exactly how everybody else feels in the room. But she immediately snaps and she walks over to where Jesus and the disciples and Mary are, and she probably interrupts the discussion, and with a loud, sort of assertive voice, here's what she says to Jesus: Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Lord, don't you care? Now, I think it's important that we stop here and we at least recognize the irony in the question that Martha has just asked Jesus. She has literally just asked Jesus, the one who left the beauty and the glory and the majesty and the splendor of heaven, and was born to a poor couple in a poor podunk town in the middle of nowhere. He arrived unannounced. People were unaware of his presence. He lived the majority of his life, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, lived the majority of his life in utter obscurity. And then when he started his ministry, he did nothing but give and give and give and give and give. And the reason why he's at Martha's house right now is because he is given to the point where he's nearly exhausted. And then, not much longer than this, after this whole event, he's going to die on a cross so he can redeem mankind. And Martha's question is, don't you care? Now, before we're too harsh with Martha, before we start wagging our finger in her face, we actually know more about the whole story than she did, and we asked our Creator the same questions, don't we? God, don't you care that I'm overwhelmed? God, don't you care that I'm exhausted? God, don't you care that I've got all this stuff going on and I'm sinking and I've got this anxiety and I'm worried? God, don't you care? We ask our Creator the same questions. Now from here, Martha becomes type A, aggressive, over-the-top assertive. She asks Jesus a question that's a little bit of a silly question, and then she pushes in farther and she says, tell her to help me. See, he literally starts bossing Jesus around. You can almost feel the disrespect. Now, I don't know how it happens in your home. Maybe when you were in the active parenting years, or maybe you're in the active parenting years right now. I don't know how it happens in your home or happened in your home when your child would come at you with a little bit of disrespect like this. But this doesn't go well in my home. Because normally what happens is I look at my child and I say, I'm going to give you one opportunity to try that again and get it right. If you don't get it right, this whole conversation is going to go a very different direction than you thought it would. And then from there, I kind of have a little bit of lecture. I remind them that I had a part of bringing them into this life and I have no problem taking them out and all kinds of stuff like that. But Martha's being so disrespectful. And the amazing thing to me about Jesus is Jesus doesn't power up with Martha. He doesn't escalate the situation. He doesn't look at her and say, you know what? How dare you talk to the Son of God like that? In the next verse, here's how Jesus responds. And you can almost hear the compassion and even the sadness in his voice. Martha, Martha, you're worried and upset about many things. Now, if some of you had a life verse, this would be it. Wouldn't it? You're worried and upset about many things. And if we're not careful, this is going to be what many of our theme will be for the Christmas season. You're worried and upset about many things. Now, ultimately what Jesus is telling Martha here is he's saying, look, Martha, you're doing all this stuff, but it's not necessary. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but really soup and sandwiches would have been just fine. Martha, I appreciate you wanting a clean home for me, but I don't really need to actually be able to eat off the floors. Martha, you're doing this to yourself. In the next verse, Jesus continues and he says, but few things are needed, or really only one. You don't need a lot of things, Martha. I know you feel that way. I know people are telling you that it's needed. I know all the pressure. I understand where it's coming from. But really, there's just a few things. In fact, there's really only one. And then he goes on to say, and Mary has, and don't miss that word, chosen. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Mary, as it turns out, made a choice. You see, Mary wasn't being lazy. She wasn't trying to get out of work because of company. Mary made a choice. She made a choice to look at all the good options that were available and to choose the best one. She chose the best in the middle of all the options that were available. Ultimately, here's how I would word it. Mary chose the important over the urgent. All kinds of things were urgent, but she sifted through all of it and she found the important and she chose that. Martha, she surrendered. She surrendered to the urgent and all the things that felt urgent. But Mary chose. And this is important. This is important because if we're going to experience a Christmas season that's uncluttered, we're going to have to make the same choice. Because if we are not careful and if we are not intentional, what's going to happen is the urgent will crowd out the important every single time. If we get really honest, this happens to us all the time. We choose urgent over important all the time, don't we? But here's the thing, just like Mary, we make choices. We can choose. And at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, we always have time for what we want to have time for. Always. And if we pick the important, we'll have time for it. But this is how we unclutter our Christmas season when it comes to our schedule. When it comes to our time, we make the same choice. So for the next few minutes, let me kind of unpack in very practical ways some things we need to do if we're going to choose the important over the urgent. The first thing we need to do is we need to develop a don't do list. You know, perhaps the greatest barrier to a meaningful life and a meaningful Christmas season and an uncluttered soul in general, perhaps the greatest barrier isn't commitment, it's overcommitment. It's the inability to sort through all the options and to pick the best. So here's what I believe we all need to do. We all need to learn to say no to some things. We need to be relentlessly selective when it comes to the things that we say yes to. In this Christmas season, there are going to be a lot of good things that you can do, but many of them you probably shouldn't. About 5 or 6 years ago, my wife and I started developing a don't do list for Christmas. And I don't know if you guys do Christmas cards or not, but and some people really enjoy that, and I think they're freaks of nature, but we hated it. We hated it because it's this awful process. You got this list of people that you got to go check every year, and then you got to make sure you have everybody on it that you got to have because you don't want to offend anybody, you want their feelings hurt, and then you got to make sure that everybody's address is right, and then you have to schedule the dreaded family picture, which if you have 5 kids, there are times where you start to think, but maybe hell would be better than this. I mean, it's just awful. And then, because nobody cooperates, nobody wants to smile. 2 minutes in, everybody's angry. And I'm thinking, why? Why do we do this to ourselves? And my wife's like, shut up and smile. So you do all these pictures, you know, and there's never a real smile on your face because it's just that angry smile, you know. And then you get the thing, and you finally get like a picture where you can choose, and then you got to get the card, and you put it together, and you send it off so you can get it back in time, and then you can't just send a Christmas card. Apparently, you have to also have this like letter about your life, but it can't be too long so that people quit reading. But it has to be short and a nice synopsis so people get a snapshot of the previous year. And then you write all that stuff and you edit and we can't be the people with bad grammar. It's awesome. And then you take it and you fold it up, you stick it in there, you do the address thing, and you stamp it and you send it off. And for us it was so draining. And we started looking at our Christmas and we're like, is this the most important thing? And we just went, let's stop doing it. I'm telling you, it was like I got a new lease on life. I went, I do love Christmas after all. It is a magical time. And look, I know, and by the way, like if you don't get a Christmas card from us, we love you. We just don't send them. If you send me one, I'm gonna have we have a nice spot in the house. We're like, oh, look at this pretty family. And I think about all the time they put into it. And I'm like, they must really love us. But we don't send them. Maybe you enjoy it. I know people who do. My point isn't stop doing Christmas cards. My point is there probably needs to be something that's a good thing that you say no to this Christmas season. And here's why I'm urging you to do that. I'm urging you that instead of doing more, just do more of what matters most. Sometimes we think activity means better, like something's more valuable because we're just running through life at breakneck speed. So have a don't do list. Be relentlessly selective in the things that you say yes to. Also, we need to do this too. We need to do first what matters most. Do first what matters most. Let me ask you a question. What is the most important thing for you to pursue this Christmas? Take a moment and think about it. What is the most important thing for you? Some of you might say, well, God, and maybe you feel that way because you're in church and it feels like the right answer. But for some of you, it really might be the right answer. Perhaps some of you can remember a time where you and God were close and you were on fire for God, and he just everywhere you went, you felt his presence and you could sense his voice, and when you came to church, there was something magical that kind of happened. And now you're kind of in this place where you're just sort of, it's cold and stale and you're just going through the motions. And maybe the honest answer for you is, TJ, I think the number one thing I need to pursue this Christmas is God. Perhaps for some of you, you would say, my children. Maybe you found yourself in a place where you're doing for your kids, but it's been a long time since you've actually just enjoyed them. Maybe some of you would say, man, my marriage. Somewhere along the line, maybe you and your spouse became very kid-centric. And because of that, everything you do and every conversation you have and every minute of the day revolves around them. And somewhere along the line, you started neglecting your spouse. And maybe you would say, well, TJ, I think it's time to focus. I need to pursue my marriage. Maybe some of you would say health. Maybe the holiday season's a time where you make bad decisions in that front and it takes you a long time to recover from it. Maybe some of you would say, TJ, I think the number one thing that I need to pursue this Christmas season is rest. Perhaps you're here today and you are just bone weary, tired. And when you think about all the possible activity between now and Christmas, there's a part of you that wonders if you're even going to be able to make it until Christmas. And if you were answering the question honestly, maybe some of you would say, I just need rest. All of us, though, regardless of what our answer is, we need an answer to this question. And then once you get an answer to it, whatever it is, it needs to go on your calendar first. And then schedule everything else and do everything else around that. If it's your kids, you need to have time with your kids on your calendar. If it's your marriage, you need to have a date night or time with your spouse or whatever it needs to go on your calendar and you work around it. If it's your health, there needs to be time to go to the gym or whatever health means for you. If it's rest, you need to schedule that too and work around it. But do it first. If you don't do it first, you won't do it. I guarantee it. And by the way, since we're talking about the most important thing to pursue this Christmas season, you know how Jesus would answer that question? Spend time with me. Spend time with Jesus. I mean, that's ultimately what he told Martha, wasn't it? Later on, Jesus actually worded it this way in another place. He says, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. In other words, what Jesus says is start by pursuing me, and then all the other stuff kind of comes after that. The problem is we pursue all other things before Jesus with good intentions of pursuing time with Jesus and all this stuff, but we just never get to it. And so Jesus says, no, me first. And by the way, if we're going to do this, here's what needs to be on your calendar. Every day there should be a slot of about 10 minutes. Doesn't have to be long, 10 minutes where you read your Bible and you pray. It needs to be on your calendar, and you need to schedule around it. Don't let things invade that time. Another thing that needs to be on your calendar every single week, not just during the Christmas season, but all year round, is this: our family gathering, our church service on Sunday morning. Not because you're going to hell if you don't come. And you're not, by the way. But it's because this is the time on the calendar where we get together. And together we pursue God. Another thing that needs to be on your calendar if you're going to pursue God this Christmas season, our Christmas Eve service. We have an incredible Christmas Eve service planned. In fact, it's one of the most exciting services that I haven't been this excited in a long time. And we're going to gather together as a church family. We're going to invite as many people in our community, our family and friends, and anybody who wants to come. And we're going to get together. And before we get into actual Christmas Day, which once it gets going sometimes pulls us away from God rather than closer to Him, what we're going to do is we're going to stop and we're going to remember and we're going to reflect. And it's going to be great. That needs to be on your calendar. What's the most important thing for you to pursue this Christmas? Put it on your calendar first. Schedule everything else around it. If you don't do it, you won't do it. One more thought about how we pursue the important things over the urgent things, and I could not figure out a way to kind of word this in a way that would stick, so I decided just to say it plainly. Be careful about how much time you spend on your phone. I did a little research this past week, and I discovered that in the United States of America, the average adult that has a smartphone spends 3 hours a day on average every single day on their cell phone. That's 21 hours a week. And if you go through the course of the year doing that, that will be just a little bit over 45 days. Now that sounds alarming, but just for kicks and giggles this past week, I decided to talk to some people I know, because by the way, I don't know if you know this or not, your phone records how much time you spend on it. I decided to ask some of my friends and family members and other people, well, what's your average? How many hours, how much time a day do you spend on your phone? So they looked it up. You know, most of the people I know spend 4 or 5 hours on their phone every single day. If you spend 4 hours on your phone every single day, that's 28 hours a week, a little over 60 days in the calendar year. 2 months. 2 months of your life will be spent on your phone. Now, please don't misunderstand me here. I'm not anti-technology. I'm not saying your phone's bad. I love my phone. I'm not planning to give it up anytime soon. Also, I'm not trying to tell you this because look, the reason I'm telling you this is because I started paying attention to what I do, and I realize it's out of control in my life. So I'm not trying to give you a guilt trip. I'm just saying I'm the guy waving the caution flag. I want you to think for a moment, if you had 3 more hours a day, how much of a better spouse could you be? If you had 3 more hours a day, how much of a better parent could you be? If you had 3 more hours a day, how much closer to God could you be? You see, I bump into people all the time who insist they don't have enough time, they don't have enough time, they don't have enough time, they don't have enough time. And the truth is, if we just get off our phones, we'd have time for everything we need to have time for. We always have time for what we want to have time for. And if we're going to go through this Christmas season and we're going to live it uncluttered, especially when it comes to our time and our schedule, we're going to need to choose important over urgent. And it probably means we're going to need to be careful about this. Let's close the gap. Let's close the gap between what we hope happens and what actually happens. Let's choose the important over the urgent.